this section, let's talk about how much do we need to worry about external validity. Maybe for some contexts we really don't have to, but maybe we do, and we need to start developing an evidence base to understand that. In a number of fields, there has been recent attention to a lack of representativeness in many clinical trials. So here are just two examples, which both come from a sort of FDA regulatory context. One example comes from study of HIV, where it turns out that most of the research subjects in HIV studies are men, but actually half of HIV patients are women. So in HIV research and in other fields, there are some gender differences in who is enrolled. There also are similar differences seen in cancer randomized trials, and in particular, increasing evidence that minorities are under-recruited for these trials and are less likely to participate. The implications of this means that the study results we obtain from these studies may or may not be applicable to populations in which these therapies might be used. So sort of qualitatively, we're starting to see more attention to this issue of representativeness in trials. Let's formalize that, though, here to sort of think through, well, when will there actually be external validity bias? So you can show, and I'm not going to show the details here, but you can sort of understand intuitively and show formally that there will be this external validity bias or problems of generalizability if participation in the trial is associated with impacts. In particular, you can show that external validity bias is a function of the variation in the probabilities of participation in a trial, the variation in treatment effects, and the correlation between those two things. So if any of these factors is zero, then there's no bias. If, for example, the treatment effect is completely constant for everyone, everyone has an effect of 2, it doesn't matter who we enroll in our trial. We will get an overall estimate of 2, and that will be true in the trial and in a population of interest. Or if we can randomly sample people for a trial, that will remove the correlation between participation in the trial and impacts, and so the correlation will be 0. So if any of these terms is 0, then we don't have to worry about this problem. But if they are not 0, if none of them are 0, then there will be external validity bias. And the average effect we see in the trial might not reflect the overall effect that would be in the population. Sort of just intuitively, it makes sense that if our trial, for example, enrolls more young people, and if the effect of the intervention is stronger for older people, the overall average effect we see in the trial might be smaller than the true effect in a population that has more old people in it. The problem with sort of thinking this through is that we don't actually ever really have data directly on this. So it's incredibly hard to estimate these quantities in actual data in full populations. So we usually sort of instead are going to be trying to learn about these factors a little bit more indirectly. So we can get a little bit of evidence on this by sort of using data in clever ways. Again, the challenge here is that to truly estimate the external validity bias or the generalizability problem, we need to have a good estimate of the treatment effect in the whole population of interest. And then we also need to have an estimate of it in samples that sort of would have participated in a maybe more typical trial. So there are a couple examples of cases where we've tried to do this. One example is Wisniewski et al., which used data from a very large trial of depression treatment. This was known as a pragmatic trial called STAR-D, and the idea of STAR-D was to enroll a more sort of representative set of people in it. They recruited from a broader range of settings than is typical, and they had very few inclusion and exclusion criteria. So STAR-D had a sort of broader population than a typical randomized trial of depression treatment. So what Wisniewski et al. Did was they compared the overall effects seen in STAR-D to those that would have been seen if they had used a more typical inclusion and exclusion criteria to enroll patients. And what they found was that the effects of the treatments were actually better in the sample of people who sort of looked like the more typical group that are enrolled in efficacy trials. Again, sort of showing that there might be differences in results depending on sort of who we enroll in our studies. I was involved in a study in education research where we were able to compare treatment effect estimates across a set of states to the results from a set of school districts that sort of would have more likely participated in rigorous evaluation. So sort of comparing the effects across the entire state to the effects seen in the subsets of districts that look like the ones that typically participate. And we found bias of about 0.1 standard deviation. So this might not be meaningful to all of you, but in education research, that's a fairly substantial difference. Many of the interventions themselves have effects that are only about 0.1. So this was showing that the effects we see in our trials might be sort of different from the true population effects of about the same size as the effects themselves. So again, sort of showing that who we include in our studies matters and might change our conclusions about the effectiveness of interventions. There also is an increasing set of research that aims to just document sort of who does participate in randomized trials and how do they compare to target populations of interest. So Varma et al. Is one example that looked in detail at the data from cancer therapy trials and showed that older adults and Black patients are systematically underrepresented in those trials. Ryoko Susukita has done a series of studies comparing individuals in the National Institute of Drug Abuse Clinical Trials Network trials to sort of individuals seeking treatment for substance use nationwide. Susukita et al. Shows that the people who enroll in those trials tend to be more female, older, and more educated than that population seeking treatment overall. Humphreys et al. And Okuda et al. Both did some studies, again, in substance use areas and documented that sort of, again, the standard inclusion and exclusion criteria of trials excludes anywhere from 20 to 80% of the patients who are seeking treatment for alcohol use or cannabis treatment across the country. And I showed in some education work again that the school districts that participate in large-scale educational evaluations tend to be more urban and lower performing than the typical districts nationwide. I want to be clear that in some cases, maybe especially this education example, we might be doing the trials in the populations that we care the most about. You know, it may be that these interventions are designed for large urban school districts. The key is that I think fields need to be upfront about that and be explicit about who is included and who isn't, so that we can understand who the results might generalize to and for whom we might be sort of less able to really understand the treatment effects. So part of it is sort of understanding even what the current situation is so that we can then think thoughtfully about whether that's sort of what it should be or whether we need to rethink study inclusion.